I'm starting a project to build an algae biorefinery in my basement. And that's going to require me to be cultivating up to 200 liters of algae at a time. And that's going to require a pretty different cultivation system. So let's go see how I'm going to build one. Hey, I'm Elion, and I'm once again experimenting with microalgae. I've actually built a number of bioreactors as I've been working with algae in my basement. I started off with these plastic growth tanks for my wastewater experiment, and then eventually I worked with the bioreactor, which is basically a miniature photobioreactor for algae, and then I built my bottle bioreactor, which I use for long-term cultivation. But none of those options were really the scale that I needed for this project. They're all maybe around maximum 1 liter of algae, and I'm going to need something like 200 liters. So I'm going to have to start considering different types of photobioreactors. Now, as a quick recap, a photobioreactor is essentially a growth tank for algae that can take a lot of forms. But what it requires is the ability to provide algae with light, air, and nutrients to survive. Now, I haven't worked with any real scalable bioreactors. I've mainly worked with things that are just lab scale, that can only work at lab scale, really, and can't be really, scaled beyond that. So, as I'm starting this new project, I want to find a photobioreactor model that I can use that can operate at scale. And the one I've chosen is the hanging bag photobioreactor. Hanging bag photobioreactors are essentially exactly what they sound like. They're a photobioreactor that is literally just a hanging bag. You can see one in the photo here. The premise is that a hanging bag is made out of plastic that is a lot cheaper than anything that we can make out of glass. And that means that cultivating algae in hanging bags is probably the cheapest method of closed algae cultivation there is. Now, the problems that come up with things like hanging bags are, first of all, how you make a plastic bag that can hold a bunch of algae, how you're able to aerate it and store the algae within it, and how you're able to provide the algae with enough light to grow. So let's see how we're going to tackle all of this. Now, I did some reading on the literature on hanging bag photobioreactors, of which there is actually less than I thought, and I discovered that most hanging bags, at least at a lab scale, are created using polyethylene. Just a big plastic sheet, essentially. You can see one in the photo. Now, that should be pretty easy for me to just obtain on Amazon. And essentially what I'll need to do is take this polyethylene, roll it out into a big sheet that has a width of 16 centimeters and a length of around 112 centimeters, make 2 of those actually, stack them on top of each other, and then heat seal 3 of the edges together to essentially make a big plastic cylinder that can function as a hanging bag. That hanging bag will have a volume of around 20 liters, which is enough for me to make 10 of them, let's say, to have a full 200 liter cultivation system, which is what I'm aiming for this project. So this should work out pretty well. And just for a quick comparison, the cost of all of that, the big rolls of plastic sheets, as well as the heat sealer, will cost about half as much as a glass aquarium, a similarly sized glass aquarium of 20 liters that I would use to cultivate algae in another type of bioreactor. So all things considered, hanging bag photobioreactors are pretty much the cheapest method of growing algae in a closed system. But even though they're cheap, hanging bag photobioreactors do come with some challenges. And one of the big ones is storing and aeration. Now these two pieces sort of go together because if you have non-motile algae that don't move on their own, they need to be constantly stirred so that they can get access to the air that is often fed through the bottom of the hanging bag. And conversely, if you have sufficient aeration, that can also function as a storing mechanism for the algae overall. So they kind of go hand in hand. And the challenge with aeration is that there are many ways to aerate a hanging bag photobioreactor. The classic way is to just literally stick a tube through the bottom and have air bubble all the way from the bottom through the top, both mixing the algae and aerating at the same time. But there are many methods for creating this air bubbling system, which is referred to as a sparger, the part that actually the bubbles come out of. And one of the ways is to create a sparger with a bunch of tiny holes. This tiny hole modified sparger, as it's called in this paper, essentially takes a pipette tip, like from a micropipette or something, and pokes little holes inside. You can see a little model over there. And essentially what that does is it takes the airflow that would normally just go to the top of the tube and pushes it out the sides. So it essentially increases the radius of bubble flow. Another option to increase that same radius is to use something called an air stone, which is often used in aquariums to also supply oxygen, although in this case, the algae need carbon dioxide, but similarly increasing the surface area of bubbles being emitted, so not only does it aerate the algae, it also stirs them. The challenge of using air stones, however, is that they don't necessarily fit well into the bag, and you often have to make a lot bigger hole to get the air stone through. So this modified sparager method is probably the one I'm going to use. Now the final consideration that I'm going to be thinking about right now is light. Light is a culture system agnostic thing. No matter what culture system you use, hanging bags or otherwise, if the light don't get to the algae, they don't grow. It just doesn't happen. Now, the thing is that with hanging bags, and with a lot of other photobioreactors similar to hanging bags in terms of culture density, light does not penetrate through sufficiently, because light often gets reflected or absorbed by even only a few centimeters of high-density algae culture. And that means that your hanging bag can only realistically be a few centimeters across before the algae past that distance aren't getting enough light to survive. Now, with good stirring, you can increase the amount of light that all the algae get, but still, if there's not enough light penetrating, they're gonna have problems with growth. Now, there's two routes that I can kind of go down in terms of the light availability that I want to go with. In one direction, I can go with the LEDs that I already have set up. And those are good, they're beneficial in terms of being able to provide continuous 24-hour lighting, and I can put them right up against the hanging bags to get as much penetration through them as possible. But the other consideration I'm thinking of right now is sunlight. And the biggest benefit of sunlight is that it is completely free. The sun delivers so much energy to the earth that there's absolutely no reason to funnel energy from anything else, electricity or otherwise, to run LEDs if there is sunlight present that can grow our algae. Now, the main challenge with using sunlight is that it's the sun. It sets and it rises. There's a day and there's a night. And that means that for around 12 hours in the day, the algae will be able to get the light they need. But there are 12 hours at night where they won't get any. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, many algae are accustomed in the wild to growing on a 12-hour day-night cycle. But accustoming my lab-grown algae to that cycle will take some time. But I'm hoping that in this project, I can grow algae using the sunlight instead of LED lights, so that this project can be as cheap and efficient as possible. So working with sunlight is the goal. I'm going to focus on acclimating my algae to those conditions. So there we go. Those are the preliminary steps in building a hanging bag photobioreactor. I'm going to need to get some polyethylene sheets and a heat sealer. I'm going to have to figure out aeration, probably using a modified sparager. I'm going to have to figure out how to acclimate my algae to sunlight. Now there is one more piece of a photobioreactor that I didn't mention yet, and that's getting the algae the nutrients they need. And I will say, that's something I'm going to have to save for the next video, because that opens up a whole other can of worms, but in a very exciting part of this project that involves me reusing some dirty water in my house. So if you want to see what that's all about, make sure to check out next week's video. Now, I will show a little bit of a sneak peek of the algae I'm currently growing in my basement in preparation for the experiment. They're set up right now in my lab scale photobioreactor, just growing up so that I have enough culture inoculum for my hanging bags when I'm ready to inoculate them. So I would absolutely say this project is well underway. I'm in the planning stage for some of these things like the photobioreactor, but I'm already getting the algae up and running, fully ready for this experiment. So if you want to follow along as it continues to proceed, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, follow on LinkedIn, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.